upcoming. So we have our research forum today is going to be on AAHRPP, or the Association for the Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs. So to help you all feel a little bit more prepared, hopefully by now you all have been contacted if you're going to be interviewed by the site visitors. It's on your calendar and you've got your time slot in place in your calendar invites. So again, you should have been contacted already by Dr. Summers or myself if you were already going to be on the invite list. So a little bit about AAHRPP. So get this view right. Okay. So a little bit about AAHRPP. So AAHRPP was founded by 7 nonprofit organizations that represent the leadership of universities, medical schools, and teaching hospitals, biomedical, behavioral and social scientists, IRB professionals, and patient disease advocacy organizations. And what you see on here on the list here is actually those entities. What is AAHRPP accreditation and why is it important? So AAHRPP is a set of gold standards that recognize the adherence to rigorous state set of human protection standards that really go beyond what the state and federal requirements are. Part of the accreditation process, it's actually twofold. There's an application or a self-assessment evaluation done by the Human Subject Protection Program, or the HRPP, which is our institution. And then after that application goes in, there's actual site visit that's focused on interviews with certain members or components of the Human Subject Protection Program. Those accreditation or the focused interviews really help the accreditation body make a determination on whether an institution meets those standards, and again, have those standards present throughout their organization. Some of the entities that seek out accreditation, here's a listing of those, but it involves research intensive universities, independent IRBs, academic medical centers such as ourselves, independent teaching hospitals, research institutions, other universities that only do like maybe social science programs, contract research organizations. So a little bit about our accreditation history. I have fortunately been able to be part of all of our accreditation history. So in 2009, UT Health Science Center received their initial accreditation. And at that time, accreditation was, their accreditation time period was actually only for 3 years. So then that meant in 2012, we were undergoing exactly what we're going through now. So we were reaccredited in 2012. And there was a change with the council, and then they extended accreditation time periods for 5 years. So then we were reaccredited in 2017, and then we are now accredited until 2022. So if we attain our reaccreditation, that means that our site will be accredited until 2027. So how does reaccreditation work? It's kind of a lengthy process, but basically what our institution does is that reassessment or the reevaluation of our institution, where we're looking at all of our policies, our practices, where we make reviews, and we basically update the accrediting body, how we've made changes in our HRPP and how we continue to meet those standards. So we underwent that process starting in June of 2020. And we tidied up everything and finished everything and submitted our application in December of 2020. The second phase of that is the on-site evaluation, which is actually scheduled for February of this year, where we will have site visitors doing the interview component of AAHRPP accreditation. And then finally, once the AAHRPP site visit, or the virtual site visit, I should say, is complete in February, then in March, they'll have a draft report that gets sent to the Council of Accreditation. And then they make those deliberations, and hopefully we'll hear back from them sometime this summer and with the full reaccreditation. So when you think about a human subject protection program, a lot of individuals want to only focus in on the IRB, but an HRPP actually is really large at an institution. It consists of the VPR office, which houses our institutional official. Obviously, our investigators and study team members, that's the largest body of our HRPP. The IRB staff, directors, chairs, vice chairs, and IRB members are a component of the HRPP. the Vice President for Research, Executive Leadership, our community outreach programs, obviously the Office of Clinical Research that's led up by Brandy Otten, the Institution and Compliance and Privacy Office that's led by Jessica Saldivar. We've got our Clinical Trials Office that's led by Jason Bates. The Office of Sponsored Programs that manages contracts and funds coming into the institution. The OSP is led by Chris Green. We've got our Conflict of Interest Office that's led by Melanie Zuniga-Rapp. We've got our Office of Technology and Commercialization Office that is led by John Gebhardt. Our safety offices such as, let's see, Radiation Safety, Radioactive Drug Committee, Institutional Biosafety Committee, our legal offices, and then finally our affiliate research offices over at the VA and R&D office, or VA's R&D office. So when we think about the accreditation standards, ultimately what the site visitors are here to do or to assess is whether the institution have policies and procedures that meet the accreditation standards. They also want to witness and see whether the organization are following those said policies and procedures. And then finally, with the interview component of the site visit or AAHRPP accreditation, we want to know, or they want to know, if the staff actually are aware of the policies and procedures and kind of practice those said policies and procedures. The domains, so AAHRPP has a set of domains of responsibility. The first domain is the Human Research Protection Program. This particular domain describes the structural characteristics and that the entity assumes responsibility for the HRP and applies for accreditation. Domain number 2 sets forth the requirements of ethical oversight of research. This is where the actual responsibilities of the IRB lay. And then domain number 3 sets forth the requirements for researchers and research staff involved in research involving human participants. So now that we've got a little bit of understanding about AAHRPP, what is AAHRPP, some of the standards and domains of responsibility, we can actually start talking a little bit about the site visit itself. So as I mentioned before, the AAHRPP site visit, this is going to be held virtually, and it is scheduled for February 2nd and 3rd of this year. And as I mentioned before, it consists of interviews. So we will actually have interviews of said HRPP components that I described before, but just kind of to mention a few, we've got our principal investigators, research staff, we've got investigational pharmacy, our legal teams. The second component of the AAHRPP site visit will be a records review, where they're really kind of focusing in on that ethical component or that domain 2, where they're looking at IRB and the functions of the IRB. They're looking at protocols, cross-section. It's basically a cross-section of research portfolio here at the Health Science Center. But the other documents and records that could be requested by the group, or actually probably are requested now that we have our pool list, consist of the IRB files, our training records, memorandum of understandings or IRB authorization agreements. It could be some conflict of interest minutes, clinical trial agreements, consent form details, scientific review committee minutes, reports to regulatory agencies, but of course this doesn't include research misconduct. So in focusing in on what an AAHRPP site visitor may ask your principal investigators or your researchers, they may ask information about their background. So, okay, what do you do in your research? What type of research do you do at our institution? They want to probably focus in on the type of training that the individual has to undergo in order for them to be able to carry out that research at the institution. So is there CITI program or what type of ethical education is undergone? We've got CITI program, we've got GCP training, we've got mentorships through working with other investigators. Maybe they're listed as a sub-investigator on a study and then get mentored by another principal investigator. So we want to know, they may want to know those types of things and query that type of information. They want to probably talk about their role in the research. So thinking about role in research, you've got your role of the research staff, understanding what the scopes of practice policy are. if they have any staff oversight responsibilities, kind of what those are, and what type of duties are being delegated to others, in which that PI may have supervising role. They may want to ask about like the choice of studies that this particular PI selects. Is it based on a certain study design? And then what is the process for you not wanting to engage in that research or turning down that research opportunity? On the other hand, we've got research staff. Those interviews will basically consist of what is your role as a research nurse, a research coordinator, or a research assistant, depending on what your role is in your PI's research. What role does your PI play in the conduct of your trial? So they're really trying to focus in on your information and your experience in working with your PIs. They'll ask you, obviously, what type of education have you undergone to be prepared to conduct the trial based on your particular role. They may ask what type of licensure is needed for you to carry out your role. And then obviously training required for your position. You can even go to the level of the type of protocol specific training that you receive before you actually implement that type of research protocol. It's important to note that any research team member will probably want to make sure that they understand processes when they're running a study or they have particular research responsibilities. When your PI is not available, what is it that you do? What do you have a co-principal investigator involved where they have equal oversight responsibilities? Is there a sub-investigator that you can go to with questions, comments, or concerns? It's important to have a plan to call somebody or to have somebody that you can find that's knowledgeable about the research if that person is needed. In describing the soundness of research design, the IRB relies upon the department to assist with determining if the research design is sound. And then again, it's really because they have hands-on practice with the department and understanding what type of goals the protocol has in ensuring that the design of the study will actually meet protocol goals. Department chairs, section chief, and center directors can also assist with helping the IRB understand if the principal investigator is competent enough to actually carry out the research. They also assist with helping us understand if there are sufficient resources to conduct the particular clinical trial or the study. And that is in terms of personnel, that's monies, funding in the department, equipment, and then also making sure that you have a good patient population to pull from. We require that the Form A be signed by not only the principal investigator, but as the department chair. And again, those two actually provide evidence to the IRB that this particular protocol has been vetted and it has some type of sound research design when it comes to the IRB office. Another area or another group that helps us decide on soundness of research design is Mays Cancer Center Protocol Review Committee. So they also perform that function. And thinking about recruitment, this is probably going to be another area of interest for the site visitors. And thinking about recruitment, it's important for you to be able to describe how you identify potential subjects at our research site. So are you using medical records to screen the information, screen medical records to identify subjects? And what type of approvals do you need to have in place in order for you to have access to medical records for screening purposes? Another component they may ask about is, okay, you got research flyers. Do they actually require IRB approval prior to you using them? They may want to know how you recruit or approach potential subjects. So who has the initial contact? And then obviously we want to talk a little bit or have an understanding about cold calling. And one of the things I'll point out that a lot of folks don't understand is that we as the UT Health Science Center all of the clinics over at the Mark, they're all considered one entity. So say, for example, you had a patient that was screened or seen in family medicine and you work in the Department of Neurology. It's possible for you to screen those records and it would not be considered cold calling. So that's information that's the level of information you'll probably want to know. Looking at the VA policy. There's a policy at the VA regarding the recruitment of veterans in non-VA research and making sure you understand what that practice is. And then compensation for recruitment. So obviously we don't allow bonuses, those are prohibited. Finder's fees are also prohibited, but we can offer or you can receive compensation for services rendered. There is the identification and recruitment of participants policy that outlines this information. And then we've got a UT Medicine patient recruitment IRB guidance that talks about the Mark and all of the UT Health Science Center being one covered entity. This is informed consent is going to probably be a big area of interest for the site visitors. Informed consent, obviously the process for obtaining informed consent. So what is your process for obtaining informed consent? Noting that there is the obtaining informed consent IRB SOP that we have in place that helps provide guidance on the process, ensuring that the language is appropriate and it's being presented at the appropriate level. I mean, meaning there's not a lot of terminology that most people would not be able to understand in the consent document. If you've got to have time to consider in place, understand that participants should be allowed to take as much time as possible to understand and go over the informed consent document and their participation plans with family, unless there's absolutely a reason that you don't have time for an individual to make a decision, like, past a certain amount of time. And we see a lot of those in in emergency research or where you're getting ready to have surgical procedures where there's not a lot of time to consider. The documentation of informed consent, that is something that needs to be in place. Obviously, the signature of the individual, there's a signature places, there's time and date, the person obtaining informed consent, witness signature, which is a UT Health Science Center requirement. And thinking about non-English speaking subjects, what the regulations say is that the informed consent document must be in a language that's understood by individuals. So when you're enrolling individuals who do not speak English, you want to make sure that you've got a process in place to provide that informed consent document in the language that they understand. Thinking about the short form, obviously the short form is in place, and that's only used in situations where you have an individual that doesn't speak English and there's not enough time for you to obtain a translated informed consent document. So you'd want to use the short form. And then understanding that for individuals who are not able to provide informed consent for themselves, that you obtain informed consent from the legally authorized representative. And there's a guidance document that we have available that discusses who and what order are people assigned to that legally authorized representative role. COVID, okay, so COVID is a big thing. And this might be an area where the site visitors want to know what we've done as an institution to ensure the protection of human subjects. So how has COVID changed how we obtain and document informed consent? So one of the things we do is we ensure, of course, that the study has been approved to waive documentation of the informed consent. We want to talk through the fact that consent can be obtained through telephone or some type of virtual meeting platform. Understanding at the Health Science Center, Zoom is the only approved virtual meeting platform. That the informed consent or information sheet, of course, in a minimal risk study where you've got a waiver of documentation of consent, can be provided to subjects through electronic means. For subjects who are unable to consent for themselves, obviously using the LAR. We just talked about the LAR and guidance on who would serve as an LAR, and the order is found on that guidance document that I just mentioned. Documenting and discussing the method of a subject agreement in the research record, that's also something that we want to make sure is in place in the time of this pandemic. We want to make sure that there's an impartial third party that witnesses the entire consenting process and signs a consent document. And this is even more so important in a situation where you've got someone who's not able to provide informed consent for themselves, because we do want to have that throughput that says this person actually, underwent the consenting process and prospectively agreed to participate in this study. And then finally, we want to make sure that we include specific language in the informed consent document regarding risk with use of any type of virtual platforms or telephone platforms, that any way that you're getting informed consent that's not mainstream or considered the normal way that you obtain informed consent. So another area where you may receive questions is related to contact. So contacting the research team or others if there are issues, questions, comments, or concerns. So obviously we have the informed consent document that outlines that one section where it talks about who I contact if I've got questions related to the study. And there's a paragraph in there that also lists the IRB as a source if there are concerns about the trial not being conducted correctly. That would be consistent with the IRB complaints policy. We obviously have information for research participants for clinical trials. And then finally, we have the compliance hotline that's manned by the Office of Institutional Compliance and Privacy. So again, there are a number of ways that subjects can voice questions, comments, or complaints, and they can use those methods. Conflict of interest is another important component of our HRPP that site visitors may ask about. So obviously, conflict of interest is for all research team members or their immediate family. And typically, conflict of interest is completed through iDisclose system yearly or annually. I think we're getting ready to, if we haven't already entered the time period, we are there for iDisclose. Obviously, the team member who has a conflict of interest, when we receive an IRB application, we'd want the Form X to be completed. And that is the way for the investigator or the PI to communicate to the IRB that someone, I myself or someone else on the research team has a conflict of interest. And in that situation, when we receive the conflict of interest, the IRB office will work with the conflict of interest committee and receive either one of those de minimis plans or some type of full conflict of interest management plan that's been drafted by their COI office and has been deliberated by their COI committee. And then also one key to remember is that those conflict of interest management plans do need to undergo IRB review and approval before they kind of get routed through the rest of the institution for final approval. Another area will be how do you maintain your files? They may want to know, where do you keep your regulatory files? Obviously, it's got to be in a location that's consistent with what has been mentioned on your IRB applications. Where do you keep your informed consent documents? What do you keep and what do you give to your subjects? A good example of this is your informed consent document. It was argued back and forth. Oh, subjects don't need a signed version. Oh, they need a signed version. And what the final outcome was is that at the health science centers, because we have a combined HIPAA and consent form, subjects are to receive a signed version, and that's actually consistent with the HIPAA regulations. So obviously that's something that you want to keep track of. You'll want to know how long you are supposed to retain your research records, understanding that there are different requirements. So your sponsor may have a set of retention of records requirement. The institution has its own. The federal agencies may have theirs. And we want to make sure that you keep your records the longer of all of those time retention periods. So another area is going to be prompt reports. So prompt reports are going to be obviously unanticipated problems involving risk to subjects or others, also known as UPERSOs, or possible noncompliance. So in talking about UPERSOs, our policy basically states that events that meet criteria for UPERSO are unexpected. They're probably or definitively related to the research. It places subjects or others at greater risk of harm. So those types of events do need to be promptly reported to the IRB office, of course, when they meet all three criteria. And then there are certain time periods or time frames for reporting those events to the IRB office. For events that are determined to be internal events, it's going to be 7 days, and then external events is 14 days. And the difference between internal and external events is an internal event is something that has occurred locally, whereas an external event is something that has occurred at another site where you're receiving information maybe from the sponsor through like a protocol amendment or a safety report. That's going to be considered an external event. Obviously, there's going to be shortened reporting time periods for certain events, and these are going to be life-threatening or fatal events. So for life-threatening and fatal events at the Health Science Center, it's going to be 48 hours. If you're conducting research over at the VA, that's actually going to be 24 hours. Understanding that possible noncompliance are things that need to be reported to us. Those are going to be events of serious and or continuing noncompliance. Noting that deviations and adverse events, they need to be tracked. I mean, not necessarily because you have to report every single event to the IRB office, but you should be tracking the information and understanding what are minor deviations versus what are constitute protocol violations, in other words, noncompliance. And then adverse events, you also should be tracking that information because although one event, two events don't meet criteria for maybe UPERSO, maybe a trend or multiple events over a period of time could actually meet criteria for UPERSO. So maybe it's an increase in frequency. So in thinking about safety monitoring, so it's important to understand how you communicate the plans for monitoring the safety of subjects. And so obviously there's a data component of that. You use the IRB form R to document or inform the IRB of the plans for monitoring patient safety and data integrity. So in describing when a Form R is required or a data safety monitoring plan, it's important to note that that type of plan is required for all greater than minimal risk research. And sometimes it's funny because sometimes you'll have an expedited study and you submit it and you're like, okay, it's a minimal risk research study. And then it gets in our office and we actually say it needs to go to the full board. You may actually get a question from us that says, hey, we actually need a data safety monitoring plan or your Form R because it needs to be vetted by the IRB. And you want the IRB to make sure that they have enough information available in terms of safety monitoring. So then you may be required to do a Form R at that time. And that's the situation in which an IRB requests a plan. So it's also important to note that discussion of safety monitoring plans should occur across the study. It's not just the PI's responsibility to ensure subject safety. It's important for everybody involved in the study to be just aware of what those plans are, stopping rules, things that are reportable, things that should indicate that maybe this subject or other subjects are at an increased risk of harm, and having a plan to stop and evaluate or let the individuals report that information over to the IRB office. Some additional HRPP terms and concepts that you should probably be familiar with include education. So what types of education do we require that you have in place in order for you to conduct your research at the Health Science Center? So obviously we've got cityprogram.org. We want to make sure that people have licensure, and obviously to maintain your licensure, there are certain continuing education activities that you have to do. Understanding that there's scopes of practice that we would want to make sure on file for individuals that may be working outside of their area of expertise or scope. Noting that research forums, we try to bring up information that's new. We try to talk about changes in our forums and practices. So those are areas of education that you should be familiar with. Communication. So communication, it happens across the institution. So it could be coming from the clinical trials office to a PI or a coordinator, from the IRB office to the PI or coordinator, from the OCR office to the PI coordinator. So understanding the communication and how we communicate with one another, how communication gets upward to the institutional official, that's also important to know, and how the institutional official communicates with investigators. Another area is going to be handling of complaints. So obviously complaints can come in at any level. They can come into the research staff, the PI, it can come into the IRB office. You know, again, we're listed on the informed consent document. We sometimes get subject complaints. It can go over to the compliance office. So, and handling of those complaints, whether one office receives the complaint, say, for example, there was a breach of confidentiality. Let's just take that for example. So that might get reported to the IRB office, but note that that information is getting reported over to the institutional compliance and privacy office so that they can make the appropriate institutional evaluations. So we, again, communicate across the board and we handle complaints in that manner. Understanding that there's IRB policies, procedures, and regulations and kind of where to find them. So the point for policies and procedures, we've got our new VPR website. And if you actually hover over to quick links and go to guidance and policies, that's how you're able to get to the policies for the IRB. The regulations, you can actually just do a quick search for the regulation that you're looking for. 45 CFR 46, I just plug that into a Google search engine. And obviously I'm going to be looking at regulations based on when my study was approved, either before the revised common rule or after the revised common rule. Noting that there's vulnerable populations. So those include prisoners, children, neonates, and others. And that there's additional protections in place. If you've got an individual, for example, who is decisionally impaired, you will want to make sure that you've got that the population is appropriate for your research. You want to make sure that that you've identified the legally authorized representative, that you're obtaining assent from the individual who's going to be actually participating in the research. So again, noting that with vulnerable populations, that there are additional protections in place for those individuals. So populations with added protections, according to the regulations, include prisoners, pregnant women, and children. And so the other, I guess, component that I'll leave you with is where do you go for specific information regarding a project, regarding general ethics, regarding compliance issues. So we obviously have lots of lines of communication. So if your study, if you've got questions about an internal study, a study that's going to be reviewed by our office, the IRB office staff is available to assist. We can assist via phone, through email. We've got our concierge services set up such that you can actually have time, FaceTime, virtually obviously, but FaceTime with our IRB staff to answer any research related questions, protocol specific questions, or just whatever questions you have in general, like where do I go? What do I do? Noting that the concierge services extends, to the other offices, such as the clinical trials office. And then if we're not the reviewing IRB, to the OCR side. So those are areas that you can go to. If you've got general questions, Dr. Summers is available. I am available. So I think those are going to be components that are important to know. And obviously, if you have been selected as an interviewee for our site visit, it's okay to say that I don't know the answer to the question. It's perfectly fine. I think what they probably want to hear in turn is, I don't know how to answer that question, or maybe I have a mental block right now. I'm nervous and I just don't know the answer right now, but I do know who I can contact to get a response to this particular question. It's important to know, I know where to go. I know where in the regulations, I know where in the IRB policies or OCR policies to go to find the answer to this question. I believe that is all I have. So our resources, we've got our SharePoint site that has some information on training. And then obviously here's a hyperlink to the AAHRPP website where you can kind of learn about the standards and the application process and why it's even important to be or attain the AAHRPP accreditation status. That is all that I have. Are there any questions?
Hey, this is Dr. Lynch. I had a terrible time getting the login to work. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you, Dr.
Oh, I'm so frustrated. And I set this all aside. Can I at least have like a copy of the slides to look through or something? Because I missed all but the last 5 minutes.
Absolutely. And if you need any additional information, I'm happy to sit with you on a one-on-one basis.
Yeah, I do. I'm nervous about the interviews.
Dr. Lynch, this is Dr. Summers. And I just to remind you, I'll sit down with you one-on-one too and go at everything that's in these slides and any additional information and answer your questions.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, I don't know. And then I tried to reach anybody to help me get on in time I spent the last 15 minutes with the wrong link. So darn it.
Dr. Lynch, we're recording this session, so we're going to
you
try.
are?
Yeah, and so we're going to try to get this uploaded as quickly as we can to our website.
Okay.
But I'll make sure that I send out the slides as well. And then you've got a session scheduled possibly with Dr. Summers.
I do. Okay.
You might be okay. There was a question that showed up in the chat. Will they send out invitations for the interviews? So as of now, you should have already been contacted. You should have already received an invite to the session in which you were going to be participating in the interview. So if you have not received an invite by now, that means that you have not been selected.
Can you post the second to last slide again so that I can do a screen copy of those? Yeah, that's what I'm looking for.
Yes, sir, Dr. Sharkey. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns? We've done this for a while. I think that I'm confident us as an institution that we work very well together, that you all are going to have the information that you need. But if there's anybody that has any other questions, if you're on the interview list and Dr. Summers doesn't have a time set up with you for training, I'm happy to be there to train and make sure that I answer any of your questions that you have. Dr. Sharkey, did you have any more questions?
No, thank you. I got exactly what I needed.
Okay. Okay, folks, if there are no other questions, I will let you get on with your day. As I mentioned before, oh, sorry, there's one question. Will they ask to review records? So the records that they're going to ask to review are going to be records that we possess. Does that answer your question, Charlotte? So it's going to be IRB files, but they're going to be things that we possess. They won't be asking you about your files. They won't request that they get access to your documentation or anything like that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure thing. I'll give it one more minute just in case there's any other questions. Maybe not a full minute, maybe a couple seconds here. Okay. Well, I will let you get to your afternoons. Again, as I mentioned before, the session is being recorded. We will try to get this uploaded as quickly as possible. There's always some delays with working with our website, but I will also make sure that we get the slides sent out. And again, if anyone that has already been contacted has received an invite from Dr. Summers or myself, where you don't have training set up with us, just reach out and we will make sure that you are ready for your site visit interview. Thank you all, and y'all have a good rest of your afternoon.